Reflections with Marilyn Baker. Brought to you by Torch Trust, the Christian organisation with a vision for people with sight loss.
Hello and welcome to Reflections from Torch Trust, the show that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. I'm Marilyn Baker and it's wonderful to have your company. This week on Reflections, we'll hear from Fiona MacMillan, who is a member of the Church of England's General Synod, a trustee of Inclusive Church and chair of the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, to chat about her experience of living with disability and neurodiversity and the justice she's seeking for others within those roles. We'll hear from her in just a few minutes. Today, though, is November the 24th, and it's also known as Stir Up Sunday, a day for making Christmas puddings ahead of December the 25th, and it's noted in the church calendar as the last Sunday before Advent. So it's a joyful celebration as the church completes its calendar year. The collect from the Book of Common Prayer for the day begins with the words "stir up," which help to give rise to the custom of making Christmas puddings. Please join me in this short prayer. Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people, that they, plenteously bringing forth the fruit of good works, may of thee be plenteously rewarded. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It's time to hear from Fiona MacMillan, a member of the Church of England's General Synod, who is also seeking change for those living with disability and neurodiversity. She chats with Torch Trust's Chris Byland.
Reflections from Torch Trust.
This week on Reflections, we're chatting with Fiona MacMillan, a speaker, writer, member of the Church of England's General Synod, a trustee of Inclusive Church, and chair of the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thanks very much, Chris.
Now, I wanted to start, as we do with all these interviews on Reflections, about faith and the journey that you've been on. Were you raised in a Christian home, or was faith something that came a little bit later on for you?
It's a really interesting question. So, in fact, both my parents had been brought up as Roman Catholics, but they both kind of lapsed and rejected that faith and wanted to bring us up with an opportunity to make up our own minds. And so we weren't taken to church on a regular basis. We weren't given a lot of instruction. But what did happen is that we were sent to church schools so that we had a broad understanding of Christianity and of other faiths. And then we were taken to church on important days, or what they saw as important days, which were largely Christmas and Easter. And so we then had the opportunity to respond to faith in our own way. Interestingly, at my secondary school, I went to a church primary school and then a church secondary school. At the age of 13, my teenage rebellion was to start going to church when many of my classmates were actually having a rebellion which was stopping going to church. So their way of finding themselves was to reject those things they'd been brought up with. And my way of finding myself was this call, this real feeling, an urge to go deeper and to find out more. And I remember very clearly in an RS class at school, the teacher saying, a confirmation comes when somebody feels ready to be more than a child in God's family. And I felt such a prompt to respond to that rather embarrassedly, I went to the front and spoke to the teacher after the lesson, who put me to the confirmation class that was going to be run with a rather imposing deaconess at that time. This is kind of the 1970s, 80s. And one of the things that she said to those of us in the confirmation class was, find a church where you want to go regularly. And there was one other person in the class who wasn't a regular churchgoer and was also exploring. So we buddied up and we decided we'd try to go to St Martin in the Fields. And we both found a place to belong. And we were confirmed there. I was then married there some years later. My sisters were confirmed and married there. My sister's funeral was there. Our children have been baptized and confirmed there, and so on. It's many other things in my life have changed, but in terms of the church that I go to, I've stayed still and gone deeper.
So Martin in the Fields has really been home for you for almost forever, really.
Since I was a child, I really feel as though I grew up at the church. Absolutely.
We'll get on to talking about the many, many hats in which you wear: speaker, writer, member of the Church of England's General Synod, and so much more. But I'd like to ask you about your roles at the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields and trustee of Inclusive Church. You yourself are neurodivergent and disabled. Are you happy to talk to us about those diagnoses?
Sure. So I was healthy and well until my early 30s, and then I had a virus and I didn't recover well from it. I lived in chronic pain with extreme fatigue and with some cognitive impairment, a new struggle to think and to plan and to process and to understand. That went on for several years. I picked up a couple of labels of ME and of fibromyalgia, and I had to give up first full-time work and then full-time study. And I had a 2 or 3 years when I was largely in bed, but I would still carry on going to church. That would be the focus of my energy for the week when I was able to. Then as I was beginning to recover, unfortunately, I got another virus, which produced some antibodies in my brain. Instead of responding with antibodies to the throat infection, my immune system responded with antibodies to part of the brain called the basal ganglia. And that resulted in whole body dystonia. That's like problems with muscle tension, muscle spasms in the whole body. It's a bit like cerebral palsy, but cerebral palsy is something diagnosed when either at birth or kind of within the first 18 months. This was an acquired dystonia, so an acquired problem with muscle spasms that affected my whole body. And that led me to needing to use a wheelchair since 2002. And I've picked up various other, both related and unrelated conditions since then. So, for example, I've picked up COVID in early 2020 and I've had long COVID since then, which triggered again this fatigue and cognitive impairment, but also came with things like high blood pressure, which can't quite be controlled on medication, peripheral neuropathy, problems with feeling in my fingers and in my feet. In terms of neurodivergence, I thought I was normal, the way that we all do. The way we encounter life is normal for us. But then since the age of 40, I've been diagnosed first with Tourette's, then with ADHD, and finally as autistic, all of which would count as being late diagnosed. And that's led me to a growing understanding of neurodiversity as a concept, the idea that there are naturally different types of minds, but we may understand, process, communicate in different ways because we experience the world in different ways. And none of these are wrong, just as not all trees are apple trees, but that doesn't make them broken trees. It makes them different trees. So just as we have biodiversity, so we also have neurodiversity and different types of bodies and minds. So I'm a great believer in the idea that God has made us to be perfectly and wonderfully made exactly as we are. We're not broken versions of another sort of person, but we're made in these fragile bodies and these diverse minds. And that for me has been at the heart of my growing understanding of my relationship with God, has led me to this sense of, it feels for me a calling, a vocation to create spaces for disabled and neurodivergent people, which includes deaf people, to come together to resource one another so we can then go out and resource the church.
That's just brilliant that you are able to share that and you're actually using that as a catalyst to do something different and make change. My question for you then is, when you were diagnosed with the neurodiverse things and when you became disabled, all quite late on in life, did that give you an outlook of being angry with God at any point? Or because we can be quite angry about our faith and why is this happening to us? Was that something that ever happened for you?
I'm not sure that I was angry at God about these things. Being autistic, I tend to accept reality as it is. You know, we're often seen as being quite idealistic with this kind of enhanced social justice imperative, this enhanced call and need for society to be a just place, but very much rule abiding. So I've tended to look more with curiosity at the things which I've encountered and the changes in my body, and wanting to understand them more so I can then work out what I can do about them, what's within my grasp, what medications are available, what things can I do differently in life which might enable me to do more. So it's not the things that God has given me which I have become angry at, but I think it's more the way that society responds to different types of bodies and minds that has made me more angry and has made me kind of feel this need, this call for justice. I think that when you're in pain, whether that's physical pain, particularly physical pain, or mental or emotional pain, there are different ways to respond, but all of us who've lived with some sort of chronic, particularly acute physical pain, grow to understand that if our response to pain is to clench up and to resist it, then we actually create more pain. It becomes more uncomfortable. But if we can find the courage or the ability to relax, to notice what's there, to not to embrace it, but perhaps to approach it with curiosity in a desire for understanding, so that we are able to accept it's there and then to try to understand it and to find a way to live in and through it. Because a relaxed body feels less pain. An awful lot of my emotional pain and my mental anguish has come from resisting reality, resisting life as it is, and holding on to that sense that it's not how things are supposed to be. Whereas actually when I have grown, and it's a journey, it's not a tick box and it's not a bullet point, it's a journey to grow towards acceptance of the reality in which we find ourselves, then I have found such a deep richness and well of new knowledge, insight, understanding, and a joy in living, and a joy in noticing what there is rather than what there isn't.
That is so good to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Let's get into your various roles, because there's lots of them to explore. Tell me about your role at Inclusive Church.
So my role at Inclusive Church came about because in the early 2010s, when we had a change of government and they began looking at disability and disabled people and roles in the world, particularly those of us who were chronically ill. And they had all sorts of ideas that became the Welfare Reform Bill. We had this strange circumstance where at the same time, say in 2012, we had the Paralympics where disabled people were being celebrated for what we could do. And it was expected somehow that all disabled people were going to have these hidden superpowers and be able to do things with them, rather than just the elite athletes. But there was a growing societal acceptance and interest in disabled people and in disability. And you could feel it. It was palpable on the streets of London. But at the same time, the government rhetoric around disabled people as benefit scroungers and, the work shy and so on led to this hostility and a growing increase in disability hate crime, a lot of articles in newspapers. And I was looking around. At that time, I was virtually bedbound, but living kind of mostly at home, and looking to the church to see what the church was doing. And I couldn't find anything. And a close friend and colleague, Claire Herbert, who was then a priest at St. Martin in the Fields, said, try Inclusive Church. And they've recently expanded to include disability as one of the areas in which they're working for full inclusion within churches. So I went to their website and they had women, and you clicked on it and it would have ideas, and mental health, and you clicked on it, it had some links. But when it came to disability, it was just a bullet point. There was no drop down menu. And I went back to Claire and said, there's nothing happening there. She went away to speak to the national coordinator then, the lovely Bob Callahan. And they came back to me and said, we'll put on a day conference on disability if you'll do it with us. And so the three of us worked together for the best part of a year, devising a conference which would be not about disability, but for disabled people, an opportunity for us to come together and share ideas, explore theology, share experience, and kind of encourage one another. And we put it together with not really an understanding of what it would be like, or if anyone would come. But we called it opening the roof, because we were opening a conversation to enable disabled people to come together in this way. And it was slightly miraculous. We had more than 40 disabled people came from across the country, people with guide dogs and white sticks and all different types of wheelchairs, people with all different types of experience. And it was good and it was glorious and we celebrated. It wasn't depressing, it was amazing. And there was a real buzz across the whole church that weekend. And so, of course, we needed to do it again. And we've carried on doing it. We're now we just had our 13th annual conference. That's what drew me into Inclusive Church. After a few years, I became a trustee and I continued to be a trustee with Inclusive Church, particularly working on areas of disability and neurodiversity. I'm due to put down that responsibility in the summer because I'll have done my full 9 years. But it's been a real privilege to be able to work with those who bring other experiences of exclusion, whether through ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and so on, to actually find the common ground. Because at the end of the day, all exclusion is the same exclusion, and nobody should be shut out of the kingdom of God.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you're there kind of campaigning and doing this kind of work, because you're right. No one should be excluded in any way whatsoever, regardless of race, sexuality, whether you're disabled, it doesn't matter in any shape or form.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I guess that kind of leads me on then to asking you about the Disability Advisory Group. So what's different about that? What kind of things is that tackling?
So St. Martin is famous. St. Martin of Tours is known for dividing his cloak in two. For those not familiar with the story, Martin was a Roman soldier in the army. And one day he encountered a beggar who was known as naked and shivering on the road. And he tore his cloak in two and gave half to the beggar and kept half for himself because it was very, very cold. And either of them would have struggled without that extra warmth. And that night he dreamed that the beggar was Christ. And so he left the army. He became a Christian. He became a monk. And eventually he was dragged out of his hermitage to become the Bishop of Tours. So St. Martin in the Fields has a tradition that we both work within the church and we then share our learning and resources with the wider church and the wider world. So in terms of the Disability Advisory Group, we are a group of perhaps 20 people now who have either lived experience from our own lives of physical, mental health, cognitive, neurodiversity, or from our family or loved ones who are kind of an important part of our lives, or from our professional lives. And we come together once a term to identify issues, suggest solutions, and what I call share some of the wisdom that grows from when we live with the knowledge of our own vulnerability in the world. Many of us have this idea that, we're in charge and we're physically well and we're kind of sensorily able, and therefore we're kind of in control of our lives. And we don't necessarily notice the diverse ways in which we are dependent on other people for our lives to stay on track. But some of us, particularly those of us who are disabled, are going to notice that we actually live quite vulnerable lives. There's a wisdom that comes from that. It's not just about need, it's also about the giftedness. I'm convinced that we are all a combination of needs and gifts. And if our needs can be met, then our gifts can flourish. And so the Disability Advisory Group are identifying the issues, identifying the needs, and suggesting solutions, because barriers are often invisible to those who aren't affected by them. And if you're affected by a barrier, then it trips you up all the time and you can't understand that it's not being taken away. But actually, other people don't know it's there and they need the help to have that barrier named and an idea of what would work better, because those affected by the barrier often also know what's going to work better. And so we identify issues, we suggest solutions, and we find ways of sharing our wisdom. That might be in leading services, or it might be in having something in the annual marketplace that enables people to kind of think a bit more about what their vulnerability in their lives. So, for example, this year, the conference was Blessed Are the Weary, and we looked at the experience of chronic illness, those who have energy limiting conditions, any disability can actually cause limited capacity. And some conditions, like, for example, long COVID and ME, cause significant fatigue. And so in the conference, we explored under the heading, Blessed are the Weary. We explored this idea of how do we find God within our faith when we're kind of often not able to do things? How do we identify Christ within our experience? How do we stay connected to church communities? How do we, rather than being left on our own, quite isolated? And how do we learn to embrace rest as actually being God-given, the kind of the Sabbath calling, which we all have, rather than something which we're taught to resist, because really people are only of value if they're able to do things, but actually encouraging the innate value that we all have as children of God. And so we had a poster in the marketplace, and we encouraged the wider congregation at St. Martin's to think about the ways in which they're tired, or what they're tired of, and what rest means for them. The conference image that we used this year for our posters was of a lovely big tree with a bench underneath and a golden dawn mist rising from the grass with a few sheep dotted around. And we printed up a pale version of this image and invited the members of St. Martin's community to add to it the ways in which they're weary, what the things they're tired of, and what rest is for them. And then we took this poster and we put it on the front of the altar for a special service the day after the disability conference. And the service was led by members of the Disability Advisory Group who had written the prayers, read the lessons. But also in one way at St. Martin's, we're particularly blessed because every year Sam Wells, our vicar, invites the Disability Advisory Group to write the words of the liturgy for that Sunday. So we have a workshop in which everyone can get together, and we invite the wider congregation to join us if they'd like to. And we write all the words for that service. So we write the confession and the absolution, and we write the prayer of thanksgiving, and we even write parts of the Eucharistic prayer under Sam's guidance, because he's done this quite a lot before. And so we get groups of people, perhaps with mental health difficulties or dementia, working together on the words of the confession and the absolution. And it's a very beautiful thing. So that's ways in which we can influence the church's thinking in our wider community about matters of disability. And within the Disability Advisory Group, we have some amazing minds and ideas, from young people who are neurodivergent or perhaps with long COVID, to older people who have acquired disability, perhaps have hearing loss, or have long-term brain injury or arthritis or various other conditions. And we come together and find that common ground over sharing these ideas and having a bring and share lunch.
That sounds so great. I really hope that people listening to this are going to take away something and hopefully do something similar in their own churches, because it's brilliant.
One of the things that we do, the reason why I told you, my ADHD brain went off on one. The reason why I told you about the St. Martin's having the shared cloak is because the disability work is twofold. Half of it is within the community with the Disability Advisory Group, and half of it is sharing with the wider church through the conference. In 2018, our conference was called Something Worth Sharing, because we recognized that people were coming to the conference and they would say, this once a year is great, but how do I create change where I am? What can I do to start these things happening? And we realized that round the table we had of the conference planning team, we had some great minds and great ideas. And so we ran a conference about practical theology. All theology is practical theology. So how do you change what you do in order to shape out what you believe? Disability has a big role to play in that. The language that we use, the hymns that we sing, when we use blind as a metaphor for sinfulness, how does that make people feel who may be blind or visually impaired? There are lots of other metaphors that we could use that don't take one person or one set of people's lived experience and make it into a metaphor for lack or for deliberate action in others. So those words we use in hymn, paying attention to those. And we had a wonderful talk from Reverend Professor June Boyce Tillman, a hymn writer and theologian a musician, who talked to us through the history of those words and what they meant and how they're so closely linked to ableism, but that ableism and that faith experience have been put together. John Hull, the blind theologian, spoke at an earlier conference about those metaphors and how painful they were and how he would argue as a blind disciple of a sighted Christ. And that learning has stayed with us, with the whole conference planning team. And now we can't look at a hymn that says, I'm blind, or the inly blind, without saying, no, we need to change those words. We need to make them say what it is we believe. And within that same conference, colleagues and I spoke about the Disability Advisory Group and about the sorts of work that we did. And we took all of those experiences and we turned them into a booklet called Something Worth Sharing, which we have been sharing quite widely. And that includes ideas about how you can start to challenge the words, how you can put together your own disability advisory group. And that's available to download free of charge from the Inclusive Church website.
Reflections from Torch Trust.
Our thanks to Fiona MacMillan for chatting to us on Reflections. Fiona will be sharing more next time with us about what she's doing with the Church of England to try and bring about change for those with disability. So listen out for that. And if you'd like to find out more about the booklets produced by Inclusive Church that she was speaking about just a moment ago, you can visit inclusive-church.org. Well, that's just about it for this week. If you want to find out more about the Torch Trust and the work it's doing to support people with sight loss across the UK, you can call the team on 01858 438 260 and they'll be only too happy to help in any way they can, whether that's helping to find Bible resources, audio, braille, or just some more information about sight loss friendly churches. Just give them a call. That number once more is 01858 438 260. Until next time, from me, Marilyn Baker, God bless.
Reflections from Torch Trust.